The heavy oak door of the basement slammed shut, the sound a dead, final thud that echoed in the damp, musty darkness. The old-fashioned bolt on the other side, a bolt I hadn't seen used in 40 years, slid home with a loud, grating, and metallic finality. It was the sound of a coffin being sealed. My coffin. My daughter-in-law, my son's beautiful wife, Clara, had just locked me in. I had heard her voice just moments before, a venomous hiss that had sliced through the quiet air of the kitchen. "You're a burden, Helen," she had spat, her face a mask of cold, triumphant fury. "An old, useless, and meddling burden. And I am done with you. I am done with your sad stories, with your quiet judgments, with your very presence in my perfect house. You can just stay down here and rot." I stood there, in the pitch black, my hand still on the doorknob, which was now useless. The smell of mildew, of damp earth, of a century of forgotten things, filled my lungs. I was a 78-year-old woman, a recent widow, a guest in my own son's house. And I was a prisoner. The first wave to hit me was pure, animalistic terror. My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic, trapped bird. The darkness was a living thing, pressing in on me, suffocating me. I screamed, a raw, ragged sound that was swallowed by the thick stone walls. I beat my fists against the heavy oak door until my knuckles were raw and bleeding. But there was no answer. Only the sound of her footsteps, fading away as she walked back to the warmth, to the light, to the beautiful life she had just, so cruelly and so completely, reclaimed as her own. But as the adrenaline of my terror began to recede, leaving behind the cold, wet sand of a dawning, terrible despair, a new feeling began to rise from the depths of my soul. It was not a feeling of surrender. It was a feeling of cold, quiet, and utterly methodical rage. A rage so pure and so clear, it was almost a form of peace. She thought she had locked away a helpless, frail, and terrified old woman. She thought she had silenced me. She thought she had won. She had no idea that she had just locked me in the one room, in the entire house, where all of her secrets were buried. She had no idea that she had just given me unlimited, uninterrupted access to the very weapons I would need to dismantle her entire, perfect, and utterly fraudulent life. She had no idea that this basement was not just a prison. It was my husband's old workshop. And she had no idea that my husband, a brilliant and deeply suspicious man, had been a master of hiding things. "Hi, everyone. I'm Grandma Helen. I'm 78 years old. And for the past 3 days, I have been living in my son's basement, a prisoner of his beautiful and deeply, deeply psychotic wife. The secret I am sharing with you today is not that my daughter-in-law is a monster. I have known that for some time, in the quiet, fearful corners of my heart. The real secret, the secret she has no idea I know, is that she is not who she says she is. The secret is that her entire life, her perfect marriage, her flawless reputation, is a lie. A lie built on a foundation of blackmail, of deceit, and of a past she thinks she has successfully buried. But she made one fatal mistake. She buried her secrets in the same place she has now buried me. For weeks I have been watching her. I have seen the secret, whispered phone calls. I have seen the strange, unmarked envelopes that arrive for her. I felt her growing desperation, her paranoia, her fear that her perfect world was about to come crashing down. I knew she was dangerous. I knew she saw me as a threat. I just never imagined she would be so foolish as to lock me in her own private archive of sin. She thinks I am down here, weeping in the dark, a helpless old woman waiting for her captor to bring her a crust of bread and a bowl of water. She has no idea that I am not weeping. I am working. I am a quiet, patient, and deeply motivated historian, sifting through the evidence of her past, preparing a final, devastating lesson in the art of consequences. She thinks she has locked me in a tomb. She has no idea that she has locked me in a war room. So please, get comfortable. This is a story about a woman who was pushed too far, a woman who was buried alive, and a woman who decided to dig her way out with her bare hands, and bring the entire beautiful lying house down with her. Your support, your likes and subscriptions to Grandmother's Diary are the small flickering candle that is keeping me company in the dark. To understand the woman who would lock her own mother-in-law in a basement, you have to understand the perfect, fragile, and utterly fraudulent dollhouse she had built for herself. You have to understand the deep, dark secret it was designed to hide. My son, my dear, sweet, and tragically blind David, is a good man. He is a successful cardiologist, a man who spends his days mending the broken hearts of strangers, but who was utterly incapable of seeing the profound sickness in his own home. He is a man who lives in a world of science, of logic, of provable facts. He is not equipped to understand the dark, subtle, and deeply illogical art of human evil. He met Clara 10 years ago, and he fell for her, completely and utterly. And I admit, fell for her too. Clara was a vision. She was not just beautiful, she was perfect. She was a curator at a prestigious modern art gallery. She was intelligent. She was witty. She was elegant. She dressed in simple, expensive clothes. She spoke in a low, cultured voice. She moved through the world with a kind of serene, untouchable grace. She was, in short, everything I was not. I was a homemaker, a woman who found her joy in her garden and her kitchen. She was a woman of the world, a woman of art, of culture, of a quiet and deeply intimidating sophistication. She was the perfect daughter-in-law. She was endlessly respectful, endlessly attentive. She would bring me small, thoughtful gifts. She would listen to my stories with a look of rapt fascination. She would praise my cooking, my garden, my home. She made me feel interesting. She made me feel valued. She wove a web of charm and affection around me, around all of us, a web so beautiful, so intricate, that we never for a moment suspected it was the web of a spider. Their life together was a masterpiece of curated perfection. They bought a beautiful, sprawling home in the city's most exclusive neighborhood. A home that was, of course, far beyond their means. But I, in my desire to see my son happy, in my desire to be a part of their beautiful, perfect life, had helped them. I had given them the down payment, a substantial sum from the inheritance my own husband had left me. It was a gift I gave with an open and a foolish heart. Their home became the stage for Clara's performance. It was a minimalist marvel, a place of white walls and polished concrete floors and uncomfortable-looking modern furniture. It was not a home, it was a gallery designed to showcase her impeccable taste, her sophisticated life, her perfect marriage. Their dinner parties were legendary, events for the city's artistic and financial elite. And Clara was the star, the radiant, effortless hostess, gliding through the room, a glass of champagne in her hand, her laughter a bright, tinkling, and utterly artificial sound. My son, David, was her greatest property. He adored her. He was dazzled by her. He saw her not as a wife, but as a work of art he was lucky enough to own. He was so blinded by his love for her, by his pride in her, that he could not see the cold, hard, and utterly ruthless ambition that was driving her. He could not see the cracks that were beginning to form in the perfect, polished facade of their perfect, polished life. The first crack I noticed was a small one. It was about a year ago. I had been recovering from a minor surgery, a knee replacement, and I had moved in with them for a few months, at their loving and very public insistence. One afternoon, I was resting in the guest room when I overheard a phone conversation. It was Clara, in the hallway, her voice a low, angry hiss. "I told you not to call me here," she was saying. "It's too risky. No, I don't have it yet. He's taking longer than I thought. Just be patient. I will get the money. I always do." The conversation had sent a chill down my spine. But I had explained it away. It was a work thing, I told myself. A difficult client. A demanding artist. I did not want to believe it was anything else. But the signs continued. Strange, unmarked envelopes that would arrive in the mail for her, envelopes she would quickly and secretly hide away. A series of long, whispered, and often angry, phone calls she would take in the garden, her back to the house. A new and deeply unsettling aura of desperation that began to cling to her, a desperation that was at odds with the serene, perfect confidence she projected to the world. My husband, George, had been a quiet, observant man, a man who had always been a brilliant judge of character. And he had, from the very beginning, been deeply suspicious of Clara. He had seen the hardness in her eyes, the ambition that was a hunger, the charm that was a weapon. He had seen the predator beneath the perfect, polished skin, and he had, in his quiet, loving, and deeply protective way, prepared for it. The night he died, he had called me to his bedside. He had made me promise him something. "If anything ever happens, Helen," he had whispered, his voice weak, "if you ever feel that you are not safe, I want you to go to my workshop. In the basement, behind the old workbench. There is a loose stone in the wall. Behind it, there is a box. The key is in my old fishing tackle box. Everything you need to know is in that box. Promise me you'll remember, Helen. Promise me." Now, Ozzy, Azrai. And Justin, Gus. I had promised him, of course, my heart breaking, my mind convinced he was just a sick and slightly paranoid old man. I had forgotten about the promise, about the box, about the key, until tonight. Tonight, sitting in the cold, damp darkness of my basement prison, my husband's words came back to me, a ghostly echo in the silence. Behind the old workbench, a loose stone in the wall. I began to move, my body filled with a new and desperate sense of purpose. I stumbled through the darkness, my hands outstretched, until I found it. The old sturdy workbench my husband had built with his own 2 hands, and behind it, in the cold, stone wall, I felt it. A single, loose stone. My fingers, stiff with age and with cold, scrabbled at the edges of the stone. It came away easily in my hand. And behind it, in a small, dark, and perfectly hidden alcove, was a small metal box. I did not have the key. The key was upstairs, in my husband's old tackle box, in the house that was no longer mine. But I did not need a key. My husband, a man who had understood both the strength and the weakness of locks, had also left me a crowbar. It took me 10 minutes, 10 minutes of a frantic, grunting, and deeply satisfying effort, but I finally managed to pry the box open. And inside, nestled on a bed of yellowed newspaper clippings, was her life, her real life, a life of secrets, of lies, of a past she had tried to bury, a past my husband, my quiet, brilliant, and deeply suspicious husband, had painstakingly and lovingly unearthed for me. There was a birth certificate with a different name, a different city. There was a criminal record, a sealed juvenile file for a series of petty thefts and frauds. There was a series of old, faded newspaper clippings about a family, her family, a family that had been ruined by a financial scandal, a scandal that had sent her own father to prison. And there was a bundle of letters. Letters from a man who was in that prison. Letters from her father. Letters that were full of a dark and twisted kind of love. Letters that spoke of revenge. Letters that laid out a plan to use her beauty, her intelligence, her charm, to marry a wealthy and unsuspecting man. A plan to reclaim the life of luxury she felt she had been cheated out of. A plan that was, I realized with a dawning, sickening horror, almost complete. And at the very bottom of the box, there was a single, small, and deeply, deeply satisfying piece of paper. A pre-signed and legally notarized confession. A confession my husband had, through means I could not even begin to imagine, coerced her into signing years ago, a piece of legal blackmail, a time bomb he had left behind, waiting for her to make her final, fatal mistake. I sat there, in the darkness of the basement, the evidence of my daughter-in-law's fraudulent life spread out on the cold concrete floor. The fear was gone. The shock was gone. The grief was gone. All that was left was a pure, cold, and utterly righteous sense of purpose. She had locked me in a prison, But she had made one fatal mistake. She had locked me in my armory. My first 24 hours in the basement were a masterclass in self-preservation. My initial, frantic terror had subsided, replaced by a cold, clear, and utterly focused sense of purpose. I was no longer a victim. I was a soldier. And this cold, damp basement was my boot camp. My first priority was survival. I was a 78-year-old woman with a bad knee and a heart that was not as young as it used to be. I could not afford to be weak. I could not afford to be sick. I explored my prison, my hands tracing the rough stone walls. The basement was large, a labyrinth of forgotten things. There was a small, grimy window high up on one wall, its glass thick with the dust of ages, but it let in a sliver of pale gray daylight. It was enough. I found a stack of old, moth-eaten blankets in a corner, relics of a life before Clara's minimalist reign. I wrapped myself in their dusty, scratchy warmth. I found a dripping tap and a small, forgotten utility sink, and I drank the cold, metallic-tasting water from my cupped hands. It was the sweetest water I had ever tasted. It was the water of survival. My daughter-in-law, my captor, did not forget about me entirely. Once a day, I would hear the grating sound of the bolt being drawn back, and the heavy oak door would creak open. She would not speak. She would not look at me. She would simply place a plastic bowl of water and a single stale piece of bread on the top step, and then she would close and bolt the door again. It was the kind of meal you would give to an animal. It was designed to humiliate me, to break me, to remind me of my new and powerless station in life. I ate the bread. I drank the water. And with each bite, with each sip, my resolve hardened. She thought she was feeding a prisoner. She had no idea she was fueling a revolution. During the long, silent hours of the day, I worked. I sat on an old, overturned crate, the metal box of her secrets open before me, and I studied. I read her father's letters, his words a toxic cocktail of self-pity and rage, and a twisted, poisonous ambition. I memorized the details of her juvenile criminal record. I examined the pre-signed confession my husband had so brilliantly and so ruthlessly secured. I was not just a prisoner. I was a scholar, a detective, a lawyer, preparing the most important case of my life. And as I worked, a plan began to form in my mind. A plan that was not just about escape, not just about revenge. It was a plan of beautiful and deeply, deeply satisfying psychological warfare. She had wanted to bury me, to erase me, to make me disappear. I was going to do the same to her. I was going to dismantle her perfect life, her perfect reputation, her perfect, fraudulent self, piece by piece, from the inside out. My first target was her most prized and most symbolic possession, her wedding dress. I knew where she kept it. In a large cedar-lined closet in the corner of the basement, a closet that was a tomb for all the things from my son's life before Clara. His old sports trophies, his high school yearbooks, his first wife's photograph album. And in the very back of that closet, in a pristine white garment bag, was the dress. A $10,000 Vera Wang creation, a cloud of silk and lace, a symbol of her supposed purity, her perfect love, her triumphant entry into the life she had so carefully and so cruelly stolen. I found a pair of my husband's old, rust-covered garden shears in his workshop. They were heavy and they were sharp, and in the dead of night, by the pale, ghostly light of the single grimy window, I went to work. I did not just cut the dress. I eviscerated it. I shredded the delicate lace into ribbons. I sliced the silk into jagged, ugly strips. I turned her beautiful, expensive, and deeply symbolic gown into a pile of pathetic and utterly unrecognizable rags. It was a desecration, a violation, a quiet and deeply, deeply satisfying act of pure, unadulterated rage. And then I prepared my first message, my opening salvo in the war that was to come. On a small torn piece of cardboard from an old box, I wrote two simple and deeply, deeply terrifying words. I used a piece of charcoal from the old, defunct furnace my handwriting a jagged and deliberately unhinged scrawl. The words were, "You're next." I placed the note on top of the pile of shredded silk and lace. And then I waited. I knew she would come for the dress. It was almost Christmas, and her annual, and very lavish, holiday party was just a few weeks away. She had a tradition, a sickeningly sentimental tradition, of taking the dress out of its bag every year at this time, to reminisce, she would say, about her perfect wedding day. 2 days later, I heard her footsteps on the stairs. The bolt was drawn. The door creaked open. But this time, she did not just leave the bread and water. She came into the basement. She was on a mission. She walked past me, her face a mask of grim determination, her eyes fixed on the cedar closet in the corner. She did not look at me. She did not acknowledge my presence. I was a ghost, a piece of furniture, an irrelevant and already forgotten part of the scenery. She opened the closet door. She pulled out the white garment bag, and she unzipped it. The silence that followed was a thing of beauty. It was a silence that was filled with the sound of a perfect world, a perfect life, a perfect fraudulent self beginning to crack. She stared at the pile of shredded rags, at the pathetic, unrecognizable remnants of her $10,000 dream. And then she saw the note. Her scream, when it finally came, was not the theatrical shriek of a woman in control. It was the raw, guttural, and deeply, deeply satisfying scream of an animal that has just realized it is no longer the hunter, but the prey. It was the sound of pure, unadulterated terror. And it was the most beautiful sound I had ever heard. She turned and looked at me, her face a grotesque mask of horror and dawning, superstitious dread. She saw me, sitting quietly on my overturned crate, my hands folded in my lap, my face a mask of calm, quiet, and utterly serene innocence. She saw not a prisoner. She saw a ghost, a vengeful and deeply, deeply dangerous ghost who had just risen from the grave she had dug for me. She backed away from me, her hand to her mouth, her eyes wide with a terror that was a balm to my wounded soul. She stumbled up the stairs, and she slammed the door, the bolt shooting home with a new and deeply, deeply satisfying note of panic. I sat there, in the darkness, and for the first time in a very long time, I smiled. The war had begun, and I, the old, useless and meddling burden, had just won the first battle. And I was just getting started. The week that followed the desecration of the wedding dress was a quiet and deeply, deeply satisfying war of nerves. Clara's perfect, serene mask had not just been cracked, it had been shattered. She was a woman haunted, not by a ghost, but by the terrifying and utterly inexplicable possibility that her past was not as buried as she had thought. Her behavior became erratic, a fascinating and deeply gratifying spectacle of a woman coming undone. The daily ritual of the bread and water continued, but it was no longer a cold, silent, and triumphant affair. Now, when she opened the basement door, her hand would tremble. She would not look at me, but I could feel her eyes on me, her gaze a mixture of pure, animalistic fear and a new and deeply unsettling kind of respect. She was no longer just my captor. She was my student, and I was teaching her a long, slow, and deeply painful lesson in the art of fear. She began to search the basement. I would hear her, in the dead of night, creeping down the stairs, her footsteps a soft, hesitant patter. I would retreat into the shadows of my husband's old workshop, my heart a steady, calm drum, and I would watch her. She would move boxes. She would peer into dark corners, her flashlight beam a frantic, searching thing. She was looking for something, a clue, an explanation, a rational, logical reason for the impossible thing that had happened. She was looking for the ghost. She had no idea that the ghost was sitting just a few feet away, watching her with a quiet and deeply, deeply amused smile. She never found the metal box. My husband had chosen its hiding place well. It was a part of the house she had never touched, a part of the life she had so thoroughly and so arrogantly erased. My next attack was planned with the precision of a surgeon. I had destroyed a symbol of her present. Now, I was going to attack a pillar of her past. Among the treasures in my husband's secret box was a series of old, faded newspaper clippings. They told the story of a financial scandal, a story of a wealthy, respected family in a small Midwestern town, a family that had been ruined by the greed and the hubris of its patriarch, her father. The clippings were a brutal and very public account of his crimes, his trial, his conviction. And at the very bottom of the pile, there was a single, small, and deeply, deeply satisfying photograph. A photograph of a young girl, about 16 years old, leaving the courthouse, her face a mask of shame and fury. It was a photograph of Clara. Or, as she had been known then, Clarissa. I had a small, handheld scanner in my husband's workshop, a relic of his own quiet and deeply suspicious nature. I scanned the photograph. I scanned the most damning of the newspaper headlines. And then I printed them out on an old, dusty printer that I was shocked to find still worked. The delivery of my second message required a bit more ingenuity. I could not leave the basement, but I did not have to. I had an accomplice. A small and very agile accomplice. A mouse. The basement was full of them. Small, scurrying creatures that were my only companions in the dark. I spent a day befriending one of them, leaving a small trail of my precious breadcrumbs, luring it closer and closer. And then, using a small piece of string I had found, I tied the rolled-up copies of the newspaper clippings and the photograph to its tiny body. I knew where the mouse would go. I had seen it, many times, disappear into a small hole in the wall, a hole that I knew, from my years of living in this house, led up into the space between the walls, the secret, hidden arteries of the home. I let the mouse go, my small, unwitting messenger, and I waited. The explosion came 2 days later. It was a sound unlike any I had ever heard before. It was not a scream of terror. It was a roar of pure, unadulterated, and deeply, deeply satisfying rage. It was the sound of a woman who had just come face to face with the ghost of her own, long buried and deeply shameful past. I heard things being thrown. I heard the sound of breaking glass. I heard my son's voice, a low, confused, and deeply worried murmur. "Clara? What is it? What's wrong?" And then I heard her voice, a high, ugly, and utterly unhinged shriek. "It's her! The old bitch in the basement. She's doing this. She's trying to drive me mad." The silence that followed was a thick and deeply, deeply telling thing. I could imagine the scene upstairs. My son, my logical, rational, and deeply, deeply blind son, looking at his wife, at her wild eyes, at her face, which I was sure was a mask of pure, paranoid fury. And I could imagine what he was thinking. She's finally lost it. The stress, the worry, my mother's dementia. It's finally broken her. And not Shundi. He did not believe her. Of course, he did not believe her. How could a frail, helpless, and slightly senile old woman, locked in a basement, be capable of such a thing? It was impossible. It was insane. It was the paranoid delusion of a woman who was cracking under the pressure. That night, she came for me. The bolt was thrown back with a new and deeply, deeply satisfying violence. She stormed down the stairs, her face a grotesque mask of pure, unadulterated hatred. She was no longer afraid of the ghost. She was at war with it. She grabbed the bowl of water, and she threw it at me, the cold, stale water splashing against my face, my clothes. She threw the piece of bread at my head. "You think you're so clever, don't you, you old witch?" she hissed, her voice a low, venomous thing. "You think you can scare me? You think you can win? You are nothing. You are a prisoner, and you will die down here, in the dark, and no one will ever know the truth." I did not speak. I did not move. I just looked at her, my face a mask of calm, quiet, and utterly serene pity. I let her rage wash over me, a wave of impotent and deeply, deeply satisfying fury. She was a woman who was used to being in control, and she was losing it. She was losing her mind, and she was losing the war. She stormed back up the stairs, slamming and bolting the door behind her. I sat there, in the darkness, my clothes soaked, my body cold, but my heart was a furnace, burning with a pure, cold, and utterly righteous fire. The game had changed. She was no longer just my captor. She was my enemy, and she had just made her second, and far more serious, mistake. She had declared war on a woman who had absolutely and completely nothing left to lose. And she had no idea that I was holding the nuclear option, the final, devastating weapon that would not just end the war, but would annihilate her entire world. The confession. And I was just waiting for the perfect moment to use it. The week that followed my watery assault was a week of quiet and deeply satisfying escalation. Clara was a woman unraveling. The house, which had once been her pristine, perfectly controlled kingdom, was now a haunted house. And I was the ghost. I would hear her at night, her footsteps creaking on the floorboards above me, as she paced back and forth, a prisoner in her own beautiful stolen home. She had become paranoid, jumping at every shadow, at every creak of the old house. She accused my son, her husband, of conspiring with me. They had terrible, whispered arguments in the dead of night, arguments I listened to with a quiet, grim satisfaction. He, of course, defended me. He thought she was losing her mind. And she, in her rage and her fear, was only reinforcing his belief. She was a woman caught in a trap of her own making, a trap she could not see and could not escape. I knew it was time for the final act. It was time to deploy the nuclear option. The confession. But how? I was a prisoner. I could not just walk out of the basement and hand it to a lawyer. I needed a messenger, an unwitting one, an accomplice who had no idea what they were doing. And I knew just the person. My son. I waited for a day when Clara was out of the house, a day when I knew David would be home alone, wallowing in his own confused and deeply pathetic misery. And then I staged my own medical emergency. I began to moan, a low, pitiful sound of a woman in great pain. I slumped to the floor, my breathing shallow, my hand clutching my chest. "David!" I called out, my voice a weak, desperate whisper. "David, help me. My heart, my pills." He heard me. The bolt was thrown back, and he came thundering down the stairs, his face a mask of pure, unadulterated panic. He saw me, a crumpled heap on the cold, concrete floor, and he rushed to my side. "Mom, oh my God, Mom, what's wrong?" he cried, his voice a terrified squeak. "My heart," I whispered, my eyes fluttering shut. I need my lawyer, the papers, in the metal box, in the workshop. You have to get them to him, now, before it's too late." He did not hesitate. He did not question. He was a man in a panic, a man who thought his mother was dying on his basement floor. He ran to the workshop, he found the metal box, and he took out the sealed, legal-sized envelope I had prepared. The envelope that contained not my will, but Clara's confession and a detailed letter from me explaining everything. "I'll take it to him right now, Mom," he said, his voice trembling. Just hold on." He ran up the stairs, leaving me alone in the quiet, dusty darkness of the basement. I listened to the sound of his car screeching out of the driveway. And then I stood up. I brushed the dust from my dress. And I smiled. The final and most devastating domino had just been pushed. The aftermath was a thing of beautiful and deeply satisfying legal violence. My son, in his panic, had not just delivered the confession to my lawyer. He had delivered it to Haj's lawyer, the same lawyer who was representing him and Clara in their quiet, and now suddenly very complicated, financial affairs. The lawyer, a man who valued his reputation and his law license, far more than he valued his loyalty to a client who had just been exposed as a fraud and a potential criminal, read the confession. And then, as was his legal and ethical duty, he immediately dropped Clara as a client. And he advised my son, his other client, to do the same. The house of cards that was Clara's life did not just collapse. It was annihilated. She was facing a mountain of legal trouble. The confession, signed and notarized, was irrefutable. She was facing charges of fraud, of blackmail, of unlawful imprisonment, of elder abuse. Her father's sordid past, the past she had tried so hard to bury, was now a matter of public record. Her reputation, her career, her perfect, beautiful, and utterly fraudulent life was over. My son David was a casualty of the war, a piece of collateral damage in the explosion of his own wife's life. He was not a criminal, but he was a fool. And the world has very little pity for a fool. His marriage was over. His reputation was in tatters. And his life, the comfortable, easy life he had always known, was a ruin. He came to see me a month later, not in the basement, but in my own sun-drenched living room. I had reclaimed my home. The house had been professionally cleaned, exorcised of the ghosts of their presence. My furniture was back in its rightful place. And I was sitting in my armchair, a cup of tea in my hand, a quiet and deeply, deeply satisfied queen on her throne. He stood before me, a broken man. He did not apologize. He could not. The words were too small for the chasm of his failure. He just looked at me, his eyes full of a quiet and deeply, deeply profound shame. "She's gone," he whispered. "She took what she could and she's gone." "I know," I said. "And me?" he asked, his voice a lost and deeply, deeply pathetic whisper. "What about me?" I looked at my son, at the ruins of the man he had become. And I felt not anger, not pity, but a strange and unexpected sense of hope. The boy I had raised, the weak, pliable, and utterly coddled boy, was gone. And in his place was a man who had, for the first time in his life, been forced to look at the consequences of his own choices. A man who was, for the first time, truly on his own. And a man who had, perhaps, a chance to become something more. A chance to become a man his father would have been proud of. So what is the final lesson from my long, dark, and deeply satisfying war in the basement? It is that a cage, no matter how comfortable, is still a cage. And a prisoner, no matter how old, or how frail, or how underestimated, is still a human being with a will of iron and a heart that can, when pushed too far, become a weapon of pure, cold, and utterly devastating, righteous fury. I also learned that the truth is a powerful and a beautiful and a deeply, deeply dangerous thing. It can be buried. It can be hidden. It can be denied. But it cannot be destroyed. And it will, eventually, always, find its way into the light. And when it does, it will burn down the entire rotten and fraudulent house of lies that has been built on top of it. My life is quiet now. It is a life of peace, a life of my own making. I live in my beautiful sun-drenched home, a home that is once again filled with the scent of my roses and the sound of my classical music. My relationship with my son is a work in progress. It is a slow, difficult, and often painful process of rebuilding. He is learning to be a man, and I am learning to be a mother again. Not a savior, not a protector, but a quiet and a watchful and a deeply, deeply loving witness to his own long and difficult journey home. Thank you for joining me on this journey. It has been a story of great darkness, but also of a surprising and a deeply, deeply satisfying kind of light. Your support has been a constant source of strength. If my story has moved you, or given you the courage to find the key to your own basement, a like or a subscription to Grandmother's Diary would be a profound honor. Remember that you are not a burden. You are not an inconvenience. You are not a problem to be solved. You are a person, and you are the queen of your own castle. Do not ever, ever let anyone lock you in the basement. Be well and be free. I'll see you in the next story. Love. Grandma Helen.